will have Dr. Haas from the Denver Health, who will be doing a presentation about the vaccine. Dr. Haas, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to join and come speak to you guys today. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the vaccine, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. And so, yeah, go ahead, next slide. So I thought I would also start just by making sure we're on the same page, hitting some key points about COVID-19. So hopefully many of you guys are aware it's an infection with a virus called SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. And folks can have a pretty broad sort of presentation or a broad array of symptoms. So a lot of folks, up to about 40% actually, may not have any symptoms at all and still have COVID-19. Whereas other folks can be quite sick and, as we all know, can die from COVID-19. We also see quite a few folks who are kind of in the middle, you know, somebody who has a mild illness, and a lot of those folks do recover completely, but a number of folks do still have lingering symptoms or chronic symptoms after they've been sick. For example, I have a colleague who got COVID last year, and it took him about a year to recover his sense of smell, but he otherwise had no symptoms. Another colleague of mine who had COVID, and he's about my age, he's in his late 40s, and he's not quite, he's still having quite a bit of fatigue and is feeling pretty tired and isn't actually exercising to the degree that he was before. I've heard of other folks who've had more troubling symptoms like hair loss that's been chronic. And so I think it's important to name that because, you know, when we start to think about choosing to take the vaccine, you know, I think a lot of times folks will say, well, maybe I don't need the vaccine because I'm not necessarily at risk of dying, but, you know, we're all at risk for having these lingering symptoms after COVID. And so that I think is an important thing to think about if we're thinking about choosing the vaccine. Next slide, please. So, you know, just to build on that, you know, COVID-19 vaccination is a safer way to become protected from COVID in the future. And there's several reasons for that, in addition to not wanting to have to risk longer term symptoms or severe illness or death. What we're actually now learning is that natural immunity doesn't protect us as well against some of the variants. So there's one of the variants so the number variant is B.351 that was originally identified in South Africa. And so that's a variant that we know natural immunity isn't as effective against that one as other types of COVID. So a variant is a different sort of slight change in the structure of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So it can kind of trick or sort of outmaneuver our immune system. And so we can't respond to it as well. We know now, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, that there is a bit more protection from some of the vaccines against some of these new strains or variants of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. And so the vaccination can help protect us against some of these variants. It looks like it might also provide longer lasting immunity. And then also we don't incur the risk of getting sick if we take the vaccine. Next slide, please. So one thing that I like to do when I'm sort of learning about something new is kind of learn about who the researcher is or the scientist is behind the work. And so I thought I would share a little bit with all of you some of the backgrounds of the scientists who've worked on these vaccines. You know, what I learned is that they have a lot of lived experiences, both with myself personally and then also with a lot of my patients. And so I thought I'd start by talking about Dr. Katalin Karikó. So she's from Hungary. She lives in the United States and moved to the United States in 1985 and started her work on RNA vaccines. And so So really the technology or the science behind these vaccines, at least for Pfizer and Moderna, goes back at least a couple of decades when she started working on this structure. And she actually had, in the beginning, a lot of difficulty getting buy-in for her work, and at one point lost her funding and was in danger of being deported. But she really persevered and stuck through, and now her science has informed, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, and now people are talking about her maybe even getting a Nobel Prize. So I think it's a really kind of amazing example of someone who really didn't give up and really believed in their work, and now has achieved some pretty amazing success. So the next scientist I also wanted to talk to you about is Dr. Kizzmekia Corbet. So she is the lead immunologist at the National Institutes of Health, and worked most closely on the Moderna vaccine. So she leads the Vaccine Research Center. And she is in her mid-30s, and it has a just impressive array of scientific work. So she has at least a couple of Nature papers and Science papers, and that, I guess the equivalent is like getting the Academy Award for Best Picture or Best Director. Like it's really tremendous work, and she's been really has wanted to be a scientist since high school, and has been really on this pathway to becoming a scientist, and has worked on mRNA vaccines for quite some time, and then got pulled into this work with the Moderna vaccine. The other scientists worked on the Pfizer vaccine, so Özlem Türeci and Dr. Ugur Sayhan. So they're a married couple, and they are both from Turkey, but live in Germany. And they worked on the mRNA vaccines for cancer for almost a decade before they pivoted to the Pfizer vaccine. Hamilton Benet is also a scientist who's been working on mRNA vaccines for SARS and MERS primarily, and also worked mostly on the Moderna vaccine. And then Hanneke Schuitemaker, she's based in the Netherlands. So she is one of the lead scientists who worked on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or the Janssen vaccine. She has 3 kids and somehow is working full-time with 3 children, and is now leading these vaccine efforts. So this is a bit about the scientists and who they are, and some, I think, it's nice to sort of see a little bit more about them and what's sort of driven them to the work that they do. Next slide, please.
We have a question from the audience asking if if Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson have different coverage between the different vaccines, or some better than others.
So we are going to get to that, and that's an excellent question, and they're pretty tough to line up, but I think I'll be able to answer that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Next slide. So safety in developing these vaccines has been a top priority. And here, so the process by which vaccines are approved here in the United States and other places, I mean, I know the US system the best, so I'll speak about that, is pretty involved. So the FDA and ACIP, so the FDA in particular gets individual patient data. So we're talking about tens of thousands of patients that were enrolled in these trials, and they have an independent review body that reviews all of the data on every single patient. And so that's one of the reasons the process can take quite a long time. And then they formulate their recommendation. ACIP is completely separate from that, and they also do an independent review and make recommendations. And then all clinical trials have an independent safety monitoring board that has no ties to the companies or the researchers that are actually doing the clinical research, and they independently review the trial, and they will stop the trial if they find anything of concern, any side effect that they're concerned about that they think is related to the vaccine that makes them think they should stop the trial. So, and then CDC also does its own independent reviews. So multiple different groups of folks reviewing safety from the vaccine and giving their independent recommendations. Next slide. So in terms of how the vaccines work, so all three actually have sort of this basic structure. All three of them have the coding material or the genetic material for the spike protein. And so the spike protein is how the COVID-19 virus or SARS-CoV-2 is able to enter into our cells and then make copies of itself. And so all of the vaccines will teach our immune system to block that entry or to bind to the spike protein so that so the COVID virus can't enter into our cells. With the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, that coding material is messenger RNA, which is actually quite fragile and degrades in our bodies probably within, 6 or 8 hours. With the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the coding material is double-stranded DNA, but that actually can't, neither one of them has the ability to become part of our genetic material. It can't become part of our genes. With messenger RNA, it's completely different and doesn't get into the part of our cells where our DNA is located. With the Johnson & Johnson, it doesn't have the right key, if you will, or the end components of the DNA to allow it to become part of our genes. So none of it, and they were very intentional about that when they were putting these vaccines together to make sure that that wouldn't happen. And so they code for this spike protein, and then that spike protein teaches or trains our immune system to respond to it so that in the future, we have the protection, our bodies know and recognize the SARS-CoV-2 virus so that we can prevent ourselves from becoming sick. Next slide, please. So a couple of key things, some of which we've already talked about. So getting vaccinated can help prevent us from getting sick. People who have already gotten sick with COVID-19 will still benefit from becoming vaccinated. And part of that is related to the fact that natural immunity doesn't probably last as long and doesn't protect us completely against other strains of the virus that we might encounter in the future. The vaccines, because it only codes for a small component of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it can't give you COVID-19. And the COVID-19 vaccines won't cause you to test positive for the nasal swab or the saliva test for those PCR-based tests. Next slide, please. So a lot of my patients will ask, or want to know, if there's someone that they identify or someone who looks like them was enrolled in one of the trials. And what I can tell you is that they were very intentional and worked to try to make sure that they had good representation of folks from multiple different backgrounds. And so I have the percentages listed here. And what I can do is actually get this translated so you guys can have this, but just very briefly to kind of walk you guys through. So I have here the Pfizer and the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine. And what you can see here is that at least 10% or more of the folks enrolled across the trials identified as Black or African American. Among folks who identified as Native American or Indigenous, that was 0.6 and 0.8% for Pfizer and Moderna, and 9.5% among the folks who were enrolled in the Johnson & Johnson trial. Among folks who identified as Hispanic or Latinx, it was 28 and 20%, but 45% for the Johnson & Johnson. Folks who identified as Asian was just about 4% for Pfizer, almost 5% for Moderna, and 3.4% for Johnson & Johnson. For folks who identified as Native Hawaiian, 0.2%. Very few people who identified as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander in Moderna, and 0.3% for Johnson & Johnson. For multiple races, it was 2.5%, 2%, and 5.5%. And then among folks who identified as white, it was 81%, almost 82% for Pfizer, about 80% for Moderna, and 58% for Johnson & Johnson. Next slide, please.
Dr. Haas, we have a question. You have used the term natural immunity a few times. Could you
Mhm.
explain what that means?
Yes, thank you for that question. So what that means is that once, so if I get COVID-19, my body learns how to, my body builds up an immune response against COVID-19. And so for 3, maybe 6 months after I get COVID, it's going to be harder for me to get COVID again. It's not completely risk-free, but much harder for me to get COVID again. And so that's I hear sometimes from folks that they'll say, well, I'll just go ahead and get COVID and then I'll have protection and then I don't have to worry about getting the vaccine. And that's, so that's why I wanted to name that natural immunity. While it does protect us, so we are protected from getting COVID again after we've had it the first time, it probably doesn't last as long as some of the vaccines and may not protect us as well against some of the newer strains. So thank you for that question.
May I ask a follow-up question with that?
Yeah.
So how long do you estimate that immunity lasts for, especially when it comes to the new variants, since we don't have so much data about it and trial and error and whatnot?
Yeah, so natural immunity from COVID probably lasts 3 months against the UK variant, so the B117, and probably from some of the variants that have been identified in California. For the South African variant, it's hard to characterize. So there have been a couple of studies where they've taken serum from people who've had COVID and then taken that serum and actually put it in a petri dish or a test tube with the B351 or South African variant, and they found that it doesn't completely neutralize or kill that virus. Its activity is probably about 1/3 of what they would have expected. So that, it's kind of hard to apply that to a person. But the way I would interpret those findings is that the chances that, like, if I have COVID and I'm exposed to someone, or I get, with the B351 from South Africa, my chances are probably 60% or so higher that I might get it, as opposed to other variants. So it's one of those things where I think there's probably going to be a lot more information about in the future. And so it's always that's one of those things where if I came back to you guys in a couple months, I might say something a little bit different based on the new information. But that's kind of where we're at right now.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of so this is the key question about how to compare these vaccines. And I will say that, like, when I first heard about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, my first thought was, well, it doesn't sound very good. I don't know if I want, like, my mom to get that one. And I mean, that's honestly where I was at, and at that point, my mom hadn't gotten her vaccine because she was struggling to find an appointment. She lives in Texas. And so I wanted to be clear on what to tell her and really what to tell my patients. And so I actually pulled down the FDA document. It's like 115 pages. And I mean, I didn't read all of it, but I did flip through a lot of it. And then I looked through the other FDA documents. And so I'm going to just share with you what I gleaned from looking at those documents. And the bottom line is that they're very difficult to compare directly for a number of reasons. So the first reason is that they enrolled in different countries over different time periods. So for example, Pfizer and Moderna started enrolling in March of 2020. You can see Pfizer did recruit from multiple countries. The Moderna was actually only in the United States. And then Johnson & Johnson didn't start enrolling patients in their trial until September of 2020. And that was right before there was a global surge. And they also heavily recruited in Argentina and Brazil and Peru and also South Africa, more so than the other trials. And that's the other reason why I think you can see the difference in the demographics of who was in the trial. They also measured different endpoints. And so when a person's setting up a clinical trial, you have to name up front what it is that you're trying to measure. And so they measured different things. So they clearly didn't meet to talk about this, and that's okay, but it is what it is. And so, so for Pfizer and Moderna, they did measure the same thing. So they were looking at how well does this vaccine prevent any kind of COVID, any case of COVID with any symptoms at all. Whereas Johnson and Johnson, they were more interested in seeing how well their vaccine prevented moderate to severe COVID disease. And so those were different. And then they also measured that endpoint at different time periods. So Johnson and Johnson measured their endpoint 14 days after the first dose of the vaccine, whereas Pfizer and Moderna measured their endpoint 2 weeks. Well, it was 2 weeks after the second dose. And so for Pfizer, that was 28 days after the first dose. For Moderna, that was 42 days. And so that was, and frankly, a little frustrating because I was like, well, how am I supposed to make sense of this? So what I found was all of them measured severe COVID in the context of their trial, either at 28 or 42 days. And so that's what you see here in this fourth column. And so I lined that up to see how they compared against one another. Now for Pfizer, and I got the Pfizer vaccine, so it was 75%, but the numbers are really small, and they've actually subsequently come out with more data showing that over time, 100% of people who got the Pfizer vaccine were protected against severe COVID. For Moderna, it was 100%, really small numbers. For Johnson & Johnson, the comparable number is 92% at 42 days. And so that actually I felt a lot better after I saw that. I was like, all right, well, this, this seems like a little bit more, a better lineup than what's reported in the news. Now, what's going to be reported in the news is what the clinical trial has to report on, which is what they intended to measure. And so for that, it's 66% protection after 14 days for the Johnson & Johnson versus the 95% for Pfizer and Moderna. But again, it's important to realize that they're measuring different things or different endpoints at different time points, and they were enrolling in different time periods. What we also know now is that with the Johnson & Johnson, it may afford a little bit better protection against the South African variant than the Pfizer and the Moderna. We actually don't know how well the Johnson & Johnson protects us against the UK variant, simply because no one in that trial had the UK variant. We do know now with Pfizer and Moderna that both of them do afford good protection against the UK variant. You might see a slight decrease in the total amount of antibody, but they still have excellent protection against the UK variant. Neither the Pfizer or the Moderna has good protection against the South African variant at this point. So that's something to keep in mind too. It also seems that immunity might come up a little bit faster with the Johnson & Johnson. So you start to see measurable protection after about 14 days, whereas with the Pfizer and Moderna, you definitely have to get full protection. You have to wait to get that second dose, and 2 weeks after that second dose. For Pfizer and Moderna, when you look at what happens after that first dose, it looks like you're probably around 50 to 60% protection after that first dose before the second dose. And so that's the other thing to keep in mind too. So, what I told my mom was get the vaccine that is available to you. And she said, okay. I hear different opinions from folks. Some folks are really excited about just having to get one, just doing one shot and being done. And I mean, I'm kind of one of those folks. I think if I had to do it over, I'd probably just do the one shot. But, I think folks should have a choice. And, I can say that more and more vaccine sites are offering folks choices. At Denver Health, we do offer people a choice in the vaccine. And so, that's something to keep in mind too, as you're choosing. And then I guess the last thing that I was actually really happy to see is that Johnson & Johnson enrolled about 1,200 people living with HIV, which is larger than any other trial. So I was happy to see that. The tough part is that no one who was living with HIV got COVID in the trial, so we can't tell how well it worked, but we can tell at least about safety and side effects, and it appeared safe. So I think I don't know if there are any other questions in the chat. Might pause for a minute just to see, and then I can kind of keep going.
I don't think I see any so far. So yes, we can go ahead and continue.
Okay, next slide. So a lot of folks want to know about side effects, and side effects are common, and I would definitely expect that. So the expected ones would be a sore arm. And I want to say that I also collapsed all the side effects from the first and the second dose. And I think there's possibly some differences, but I think it's also hard, again, to compare them directly. So when you see that, half the folks with the Johnson & Johnson had a sore arm versus most of the folks with Moderna, that also includes like the second dose for Pfizer and Moderna. And so what's common is a sore arm. I had a sore arm. Fevers, particularly after the second dose, I think are pretty common. A lot of folks have body aches, feel pretty fatigued, is pretty common. Headache is also pretty common too. I haven't seen personally a lot of folks with vomiting, but it's certainly listed. And then more probably anecdotal reports after the trial of folks having swollen lymph nodes. And then I've heard of a few folks having some dizziness. So the swollen lymph nodes will happen under the arm, primarily where you got the vaccine. I did hear one report. So my husband shared with me that he didn't think that he could do push-ups or pull-ups as much as better, as well as he did before after the vaccine. And I keep telling him I haven't seen that as a reported side effect, but he's not convinced. So we're still debating that one. And the reason for the sore arm is really from the injection. And so, almost all shots will have some pain at the injection site. And so when they asked people about how did you feel after you had the vaccine, and they wanted to hear about everything, folks were honest and they said, well, it kind of hurt a little bit because I got a shot. So that's why you saw that reported so often.
Wow.
That's a good question.
Thank you. That was okay. Yep, that was a question there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I saw that one pop up. Just okay, next slide, please. One thing that is really important that I want to be clear about is that personal information is protected. An ID is not required. Your insurance is not required. And I know that there are community vaccination events that are asking for this. They are not supposed to be asking you for that, and don't feel like you need to share that. We do want to, see, we want you to share your name and date of birth, simply because we want to, especially for the Pfizer and the Moderna, we want to be able to ensure that we have accurate information on your vaccine card, and that we're able to make sure that, like, if you had to go back for a vaccine at a different place, that information is kept so that if you go to a different place, we'll have that information so that we can sort of verify what dose you need. If you lose your card, so that you can get that replaced. But it's protected, and it's not shared with anyone beyond like a health center or a vaccination site. And so I also want to hear, so if you guys hear of other community vaccination sites asking for ID and insurance information, send that my way, because I elevate that all the way to the state medical officer, because it's not supposed to be happening.
So you don't need health insurance to get the vaccine?
No, it's free, totally free. And it's free for anyone. So irrespective of immigration status, frankly, I mean, if somebody flew in from Botswana and got stood in line for a vaccine, they could get a vaccine. That's really how it's supposed to work. So, so yeah, if anyone's asking you for that, you just tell them you don't need to share that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Next slide, please.
I think we have another question that just popped up.
Oh, yes.
All right. So there are some news about a microchip or some molecules being added in the vaccine. Is it true, or is fake news from anti-vaccinators?
Yeah, I've gotten this question before. It's actually a pretty common question. So it is fake news. And what I'll tell you is in some ways it would be, I mean, I think it'd be impossible for them to put a chip in there. So the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine is really just a coating of fat around, so it's a lipid layer with some salts and sugar around the actual messenger RNA. And that's part of the reason we've had issues with storing it so carefully, because it's so fragile. So there's no way, like even like with that sort of fragile sort of construct, it's almost like just like a bubble. I don't think there's any way they could do that. That wasn't their intent at all. And then for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they use an adenovirus construct. So it's a virus where they've, that it's the outer shell of a virus that causes the common cold. And so they pulled out all the other genetic material and then just put in the small coating for the spike protein. So again, it's not something that could hold a chip, or if you will, and it was never the intent of the vaccinators to do that. But I do get that question a lot, and I think it's important to take that on and address it, because I mean, folks are, they hear it and they're concerned.
Right. We have another one. It said, it's a comment. It says that there's a Walmart pharmacy that asked for health insurance, and that was a direct experience in Pueblo on Prairie Street.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And again, they're not supposed to. So what's happening is that folks are trying to recoup some costs related to the administrative fee. And so that's why they're asking for that, but they really shouldn't be doing that. So I'll take that back to my boss so that we can elevate that. And again, I would just decline, say, I'm not, I know that I don't have to share that information.
So it shouldn't be no copay related to that, or no out-of-pocket expenses to receive the vaccine.
That is correct. It should be free.
All right. I think another one came up. It says that King Soopers is also asking for health insurance information, but it says too late for us, but they took it down.
Yeah. So if you guys get a bill from them at all, what I can do is share my information. So what I'll do is take that, we can sort of connect offline, and we can take that bill and elevate that forward, because you shouldn't be getting a bill.
Good.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's another participant who said they received an email from Walgreens also asking to bring health insurance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's again, they're trying to recoup some of these costs from the administrative fee, but they really, you're not obligated to provide that. So
we have another question.
Yeah, these are good. I love these questions. Okay, so for the messenger RNA vaccine, what if your DNA or RNA doesn't have full or successful replication? Is it safe? So I want to clarify it. I think what I'm hearing is that, so if the vaccine doesn't work for whatever reason, or falls apart, or doesn't work inside our cells, is it still safe for a person to get the vaccine? Does that sound right? Okay, great, thank you. So it is still safe, and that's one thing. I mean, we are, even though there's 66% to 95%, that's still not 100%. And we're seeing a handful of folks who've gotten the vaccine and have gotten COVID afterwards. It's hard to know what's happening for those folks. One person was a colleague of mine, and she actually got COVID from her daughter, and she was really upset, but she was feeling fine. And I think the vaccine probably helped her from getting super sick. So it's safe. It just may be that that if that happens to a person, you wouldn't necessarily have full protection. But I do think that any vaccine probably offers partial protection. And certainly these vaccines are actually, even the Johnson & Johnson are more effective than our normal flu vaccine, which is usually about 50% effective. And we all still get some benefit if you take the flu vaccine. So it's a good question.
We have one more. We have a hand raised from Wendy Mamata.
Okay.
Wendy, you're on. You unmute yourself. cannot hear you. Can you type the question in the chat box or the Q&A box?
I don't have a question at this time.
Oh, okay. All right. We just saw that your hand was raised. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So on this slide, it was just a compilation of individual perspectives of folks who've gotten the vaccine. And these are all on the Colorado Vaccine Equity Task Force website. They're also already in Spanish. And I'll just read through just a couple so that you guys can hear what other folks have said. So Dr. Anuj Mehta is a colleague of mine. He's a pulmonologist at Denver Health. He got his vaccine and felt like he said it was safe and can help ease the burden of the pandemic that the pandemic has had on our communities. Maisha Fields, she said, as an African-American woman and a provider, I've seen firsthand the blatant attack that COVID has had on people of color. Richard Casillas, he said, I would feel safer if more people got vaccinated. I've got friends who've gotten sick and ended up in the hospital. Within 6 or 7 days, they were dead and they were gone. Other folks said it was a tough time right now, and thank God I'm able to be selected to get one of the early doses of the vaccine. And so a lot of folks, who are presenting or choosing to get the vaccine, a lot of folks have chosen it because they have had some personal impact with COVID. And that's why they're going to choose to get the vaccine. Oh, great question about when the kids are getting the vaccine. So sooner than we thought. So Pfizer just released information about their study in 12 to 15-year-olds. And what they did is they measured the amount of antibodies or proteins that the immune system can produce in response to COVID, and their results looked really good. And so I think what's going to happen is that they'll apply to the FDA for emergency use approval in the next few weeks. And so that could mean that sometime in May or June, we might be able to offer it to 12 to 15-year-olds. And then so Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are all going to start enrolling kids down to the age of 6 months and studying younger children. And my guess is the results from that younger group won't be available till the fall, but it's hard to know. They're mostly measuring antibody production. They're not necessarily looking to see who gets COVID and who doesn't. And so in some ways it's easier to figure out how well it's going to work if you're not waiting for people to get COVID and naturally and be exposed to COVID. So I'm hopeful. I've got a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, and so they're not ready to get another shot, but I think I'm ready for them to get another shot. And then so this is another great question. So if you had the vaccine, what symptoms? So this is good. This is a great question. And this can be subtle. So I also have a colleague of mine who, as best we can tell, probably contracted COVID while he was waiting for the vaccine. So it's just really, really tough situation. He was talking to someone else in line. They were distanced and masked. And she had COVID and then didn't realize it because she didn't have any symptoms. And then we think that's how he got it. So so the way you can tell is, so we wouldn't expect fevers and chills and, probably beyond 3 or 4 days after getting the vaccine. So if you have symptoms like that 3 to 4 days after your vaccine shot, that's when I would worry that it's not from the vaccine and it could be actually COVID. And so that's when I would recommend to get tested. With my friend, he developed symptoms he was feeling fine, actually had some body aches and then was feeling fine and then started having symptoms again on day 5. And so that's how he ended up presenting. Other symptoms like upper respiratory symptoms, like having a cough or having nasal stuffiness, a sore throat, that I wouldn't expect from the vaccine. That was really rare, if rarely, I don't know that it even reported any of those symptoms. So if you had those symptoms, then I would actually worry more about COVID, and would advocate for someone to get tested. And so for someone, if you're having something like that and you kind of fall in between, you're not really sure, then, I'd recommend talking to, if you have a primary care provider, talking with them. If you don't have a primary care provider, calling one of the nurse lines, and getting some advice about that. I can also share the Denver Health nurse line, and if you speak Spanish, you would press 2 to talk to someone through the Denver Health nurse line, and then press 3 for other languages. Got another great. Oh, go ahead.
I said we have another interesting question.
I saw that.
Some say you shouldn't drink water for 3 days before being vaccinated. Is that true?
So it's a good question. I have not heard that, and that's not something I would recommend. I think my concern is that I'd worry if someone was a little bit was dehydrated. And so I would recommend to drink the same amount of fluids that you always do before you get the vaccine. So it's a good question. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, I think. So other things to keep in mind. So vaccination is a key part of what we're hoping folks will be able to do to stop the pandemic. It's one of the choices that we're hoping some folks will be able to make, but it's not the only thing. And so if you end up not choosing to take the vaccine, the other tools are even more important, to continue to wear a mask. And especially when you're leaving the house, and continue to practice social distancing, staying at least 6 feet away from people who you don't share a living space with, trying to avoid crowds and poorly ventilated spaces, and to continue to wash your hands. So all the things that we're doing now to continue to do those, and even do those even after you're vaccinated. Next slide, please. So one thing that CDC finally has sort of loosened up about, which I personally find exciting, is that when people are vaccinated, so now I'm vaccinated, now my mom is vaccinated, she lives in Texas, so now I can see her and be around her without a mask, because neither one of us, because both of us are vaccinated and protected. And so that's, I think, a really exciting thing, that we can start to see other friends, see other family, and move about a little bit more if those friends and family members are also vaccinated. And so it's something to keep in mind, with a few other considerations to be careful. So, if I'm going to a friend's house who's vaccinated, but they live with someone who is either unvaccinated and sick for getting COVID, or also has other medical problems that make them higher risk for having severe COVID disease, then I still need to wear my mask. If I'm going to, larger gathering, I still need to wear my mask, and everyone else needs to be in a mask. And so there's just some other practical things to keep in mind. So we can visit other vaccinated folks, at least visit one other household. But if we're visiting folks beyond that, or visiting folks who are unvaccinated and at risk for severe COVID, then we still need to be in a mask. Next slide, please. And so let's see what time it is. So this is a compilation of the different vaccine sites, some of the major ones, and vaccine information across the city and state. So my team, they secret shopped all of these sites to sort of see what accessibility was available by language. They're one of these days you guys will have to meet my team, because they're a pretty amazing group. So this is just a summary, and what I have to say is that there definitely are some barriers by language, which is frustrating, and it's something that we've been continuing to elevate. For the Denver Health Vaccine Hotline, it's actually the only one that I could find that had the ability to get quickly to languages other than English or Spanish. And so what you should know is that, it says it in English to press 3 for other languages. But if you call that number to schedule, you can skip the phone tree and just press 3. And they're often able to schedule people pretty quickly. Right now, honestly, the phone lines are blown up because they just opened it up to everyone. So so it's not as accessible as it was, say, last week. But often people can schedule either directly or they're put on a waiting list that gets that you can sort of get, that they'll get back to you within a few days. I just talked to my director before this call, and he was anticipating there'd be more and more availability, not just at Denver Health, but across the city. I know Denver Health isn't always convenient, and let's be honest, not everybody wants to come to Denver Health, and that's okay. There's certainly other choices out there. I think the next probably most accessible choice would be, in a perfect world, Dick's Sporting Goods or the ballpark. And they do at least have their information in English and Spanish on their website. So you can register in Spanish, and then you have to call to get other languages. Calling is a little tough because you have to sit there for 1 minute and 40 seconds, but you can eventually get to a live person, who can, and then you can, say the language that you need, and then they'll get you connected with someone. UC Health is pretty good. When you call the line, they only give the option in Spanish, but if you stay online long enough, which can be a while, it can be a couple minutes, then you can get to a live person who can then sort of walk you through how to get on their waiting list. And then the CDPHE web number is, the phone tree is all in English, but if you press 2 for Spanish and 1 for other languages, then you can get to someone and get to who can talk to you and give you some advice about how to schedule for the vaccine. And I think that's it. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So someone had a question about Walgreens. So, we found that Walgreens and Safeway, that most of the time you have to go to the website. We need to actually circle back because we haven't secret shopped them in a couple weeks, and most of it's in English, but you can still try and go to their website. And then there's also other sites, vaccinefinder.org, which pulls in all of the pharmacies. All of that's in English, but if you can get to that, it'll you can see what's available across the city and state. And then if you're ready for a road trip, apparently Mesa County has some openings in Grand Junction. I guess they have about 500 extra slots each day. I don't know that I personally would be up for that. But I just wanted to throw that out there in case, or if you know someone who lives out that way, who's searching for a vaccine appointment, they could connect out there. So the Denver City website, so they're constantly updating this and trying to make things more accessible. So you can also find up-to-date information on the Denver City website. CDC also has information in multiple languages as well, so you can go there too. So we'll share that out.
Alrighty.
And I think that's it. Oh yeah, so if you get COVID and you don't have health insurance, you don't have a primary care provider, our team can actually provide support to you. So we're completely free. What we can offer is to visit you in your home. So we'll show up in a mask, and then we put on a gown and what have you, and we'll monitor you with a pulse ox. We can assess everyone in the whole house and link you to a telehealth visit that's often with me personally until we can link you with a regular provider. We also have a social work team and a resource team, and so we can connect you with rent support. We actually contract with Amazon Fresh, and so we've had a few glitches this week, but most of the time we can get food out to you within a day or so, and then do other referrals as needed. And so that's our information. We prefer phone calls simply because, I can't guarantee that your personal information will be secure if you email us. But if that's something that you want to explore, you're interested, definitely give us a call and we'd be happy to support you.
Thank you. And also Wendy Smithick shared that Second Chance in Aurora is having a pop-up vaccine clinic on April 16th. So information, I guess, for attendees.
Yeah, that's great. Next slide. And that's it. So other questions